So, hello. Thanks again for being with us, for attending this seminar. Good morning for the ones that are in Brazil. I think that for most of you, it's good afternoon. So, I'm Marco Lentini. I'm a Senior Forest Officer at Imaflora for forest projects and forest services. I hope my audio is well. So, in terms of the risk assessment in Brazil for timber legality, Preferred by Nature have been working in this methodology since 2007, has been applied in a lot of countries and a lot of scopes in partnership with several organizations. And it's important from this methodology that is also developed from the views, from the expertise of local stakeholders. This methodology was developed both by FSC and Preferred by Nature. In Brazil, Imaflora has been doing this work on assessing and also, in this case, updating the timber legality assessment. The last version that we have available is for 2017. So we have been doing our work on updating that. So we'll be releasing a new version that is valid for January 2022. So what we try to do, and we talk a little bit about that, is to review national, subnational regulatory issues, if it's subnational and national law, in relation to forest production. Next one, please. We always have some problem last one. And I guess a major question at what this risk assessment that we did in Brazil has to do with the presentation from UDR that Ivan did. So the intention is to have an instrument, a report that will bring support for the application of these regulatory requirements that we have right now. First of all, to have verifiable and comparable risk categories. So we will have a very clear division of categories, subcategories, and also metrics that are associated with timber supply chains in Brazil. We hope that that methodology will also help a lot of producers, also the traders and market operators in verifying this criteria to understand well what are the legal and regulatory requirements. So, and also bring a lot of points of attention. So which points of the compliance with the law for different scopes are important in terms of considering during the due diligence procedures. And finally, we hope that this instrument will also help in procurement policies, both from for market operators, both from the public sector, but also for private sector operators. Ivan, please. Oh, yeah. So what is new in this new version that you have access to is that we have now 3 geographical scopes. So the first one, we try to qualify the risk for the management of natural forests. So to give a very brief overview on that, so is allowed in Brazil is allowed to harvest timber and other products from natural forests in private lands in a process where the producers have to submit a forest management plan, and these forest management plans have a lot of regulatory issues to be licensed related to the planning of the harvesting operations, minimize impacts during these operations, working conditions, and things like that. So that's one scope that we evaluated. And when we are talking about natural forests here, it's pretty much for the Brazilian Amazon. Second geographical scope that was evaluated is in managed planted forests. And that's an important point. We consider the planted forest for the entire Brazilian territory, which means that while most of the plantations, and we'll talk about that, but most of the plantations are in South and Southeastern Brazil, We consider the scope for the entire country. And finally, what is new in this version is considering in a separated way the management of natural forests on public lands, which in Brazil are regulated by a system of concessions. So that's new in this version. Please, Yvonne. So, and to give a very brief overview of the forest sector in Brazil, I think most of you know a lot about it, but just to be on the same page. So Brazil is a large country, but it is interesting that most of the territory is covered by forest, at least 60% of the territory. We are talking about something about around 500 million hectares of forest. And most of this forest is concentrated in the Amazon. So according to official data, Amazon has around 330 million hectares of forest. We have, according to data from the sector, also something around 10 million hectares of forest plantations, which are very concentrated in South and Southwestern Brazil, around 90%. So we are talking pretty much about plantations of eucalyptus and pinus, mainly for pulp and paper production. But we also have around 400,000 hectares of other species in planted forests as well, pretty much on rubber, acacia, teak, and parica. And about the third scope that we have been evaluated, the concessions. So until the beginning of 2022, it's important to highlight that we pretty much had 4 concessions operating in the Amazon. So you can see there the active concessions and the planned concessions. And by the beginning of 2022, we had 18 contracts, which were around 1 million hectares of concessions in the Amazon. These numbers change a bit by this point in time, which I think is good news. I mean, we have been speeding up the pace of implementation concessions in the Amazon. And just to cite also that from 2023 on, we probably will also have concessions in other places in the country, mostly south of Brazil. But in 2022, we had then 1 million hectares of concessions. We also included in this scope concessions that were run by states. So we had 8 contracts from the state of Pará in the state public lands, and Amapá also 1 contract for concessions. It's important to cite, and I guess that will influence a lot of the results that we show, that concessions have been developed in Brazil in a different context in terms of control, in terms of verification, monitoring. So it was considered during our analysis, and that will reflect a bit on the results that we show in a few moments. Next one, please. So talking a little bit about this methodology, what we do. So first, of course, it's important to remember that is a legality check. So it means that even categories or subcategories that are not required by Brazilian law, they are not evaluated. So we check what the legislation in Brazil asks, and also including the legislation at subnational level for states. We also analyze published data and reports in terms of pretty much materials that could guide us in terms of the risks for the aspects, for the categories that were evaluated in the assessment. We conduct interviews with key actors, experts, try to have a sample also that include different sectors. Governments, production sector, market, civil society, and one important point to mention also is that we have pretty much 2 categories of risk. So the first one is low risk, in terms of severity, in terms of the geographical scope, in terms of intensity. And when the risks were not considered low, they are classified as specified risk, right? So it doesn't mean medium, doesn't mean high, it means there is a specified risk in terms of scope, severity, intensity. We also have a category that is called non-defined. Why? Because as I said, what we did is a checking of the Brazilian legislation. So if the Brazilian legislation do not ask for a given aspect, we could not say that the risk is low or specified because it's not required by law. I will show a bit on the aspects of that, but the assessment is divided in 7 categories. We'll talk a bit about that. And these categories are divided into subcategories. So at the end, we had 26 aspects, if I could say, that were assessed in this work. Next one, please. So the first one is the legal rights to harvest. So it pretty much looks if a given enterprise indeed have legal access to land, to the forest resources, it has been achieved the licenses. So what we are seeing is the risk associated to not having these licenses, not having legal access to land for each geographical scope. It has 4 subcategories, as we call. So it looks into the harvesting legal risks, harvesting rights, the concession licenses. The risk is related to the management per se, and the harvest planning, and the harvest license. Next one, please. So the second one is about the taxes and fees. So whether there is a risk of the forest management operator, the producers, the subcontractors are paying the taxes and fees that are due to law, they're required by law. So we look into the royalties, the harvest fees, sale taxes of the forest products in a general way, also income tax and profits from the operations. The timber harvesting activities look on the harvesting per se. So there is a very robust Brazilian environmental legislation, regulatory conjunction of instruments that regulate, for example, if the planning of harvesting is conducted in a certain way. It also includes environmental issues, conservation issues, labor requirements. So probably one instrument that most of you know well is the Brazilian Forest Code, that has a lot of implications relation also to the how the forest reserves and how permanent preservation areas are maintained. So includes timber, the regulations for harvesting, the due requirement in terms of sites that have to be protected, areas that have to be protected. For one good example is riparian zones, species protected by law, environmental requirements during harvesting per se, and also, as I said, the working requirements, both in terms of health and safety of workers, but also in complying with law when hire people for the operations. Third-party rights is a category that looks whether there are in that each of the geographical scope, what are the risks associated to the rights of local, traditional, indigenous populations that will conflict with the management or harvesting in those areas. So looks on the customary rights from these populations. FIPIC, free, prior, informed consent, and also the rights of indigenous and traditional people. Trade and transport, we'll see the portion of the chain, so leaving the forest, if I could say like that, looking at the transportation, the trade of the wood products, if the regulations are being complied. Also, if during these parts of the production chains, there is a risk of mixing with other products. that would solve what the risk associated with mixing and contamination of these products. So you look on the correct classification, species, quantities harvested or transported, traded, processed, the qualities that are written in reports, in the invoices, trade and transport, also offshore trading, customs regulations in the case of exportation markets, and codes. Due diligence is a category that pretty much asks if the country is complying with the specific legislation regulating the need for due diligence in the production chain. And of course, Brazil does not have one related to that. We'll talk that in a little bit. And finally, legality in timber processing look on the environmental aspects, also social aspects, including labor aspects during the other parts of the chain. So during the processing, during the trading. So looks on the legal registration of these companies, the environmental requirements, the health and safety, but also legal employment in the other parts of the production chain related to processing. So, and of course, again, you guys will have access in a few weeks of all these materials, but talking a bit about the conclusions, first we had a lower quantity of specified risks on concessions, which is not surprising. As I said, I think that was highly influenced by the environment of control, of monitoring, verification that concessions in Brazil have been developing. So we found specified risks in concessions for 11 subcategories from the 26, low risk for 13. The geographical scope that have associated with larger risks is management natural forest in private areas, which were found specified risks for 19 subcategories from the 26. And of course, the management of planted forest was in the intermediate way, where we found specified risk for 15 subcategories. It's very important to say that some people would argue that, for example, well, planted forests in Brazil should achieve lower risks in general, but most of people would say that that would be based pretty much in the large commercial plantations southeastern Brazil. I'm doing this disclaimer here because, again, it's important to remember that our geographical scope included planted forests in other places of the Brazil as well, not only restricted to the large commercial plantations in South and Southeastern Brazil. So we don't need to go through all details on that, so we will have access to that, but that's the table that summarizes the assessment. And again, you can see that for the legal harvesting divided by the 3 scopes and the risks that are present for each subcategory there. Here we have legal rights to harvest and taxes and fees. Next one, please. Timber harvesting activities. So I will talk about some points of attention, but we see a lot of risks related to environmental aspects, also working conditions in general. In third-party rights, again, there's a high risk related to all scopes. You can see there a practical example of a subcategory that is not required by Brazilian law, which is free, prior, and informed consent. So there's no Brazilian legislation for that. That's the reason why it's classified. It doesn't have a classification risk. Next one, please. Trade and transport probably was the category in general that was associated with lower risks. Due diligence is another practical example of legislation, regulation that is not present in Brazil. There's not a requirement to do that internally to Brazil, to the parts of production chain. Next one, please. Illegality in timber processing, again, this emphasis we want like to bring in terms of the working conditions in general. Next one, please. So general considerations would be that, again, we have found this assessment that public forest concessions have been produced the lowest legality risks for most of the categories. At least half of the subcategories that were evaluated in the assessment are considered low risks. In terms of if we could bring a general consideration about the assessment, is that social issues in general, health and safety at work, legal work, labor legislation, rights of traditional populations, in general, present specified risks for all the geographical scopes that we have been evaluating during this work. And of course, that risks that are associated with portions more upstream of these chains, or again, more close to the producers, tend to be lower, which meaning that more complex chains or risks to the more downstream, more close to the trading, present more ranking of risks. So we will have all this information, these results available, I guess, in a few weeks, in two resources. One is Preferred by Nature Sourcing Hub that can also do a search by commodity, by country, so be available there. And next one, please. Also, Imaflora maintains a platform named Timberflow. There's the link that is focusing on presenting a set of tools that we hope to support public and private market operators, their procurement efforts. In the second half of this year, we intend to launch a tool that will help in some important parts of the due diligence systems. For example, geolocation will be assisted for the timber supply chains. And I think that's it. So I would like to thank you very much. We look forward to look at your questions, but again, we are available to be contacted about this work.